Moscow. For months, President Vladimir V. Putin has predictably denied accusations of Russian interference in last year's American election, denouncing them as fake news fueled by Russophobic hysteria. More surprising, some of Mr. Putin's biggest foes in Russia, notably pro-Western liberals who look to the United States as an exemplar of democratic values and journalistic excellence, are now joining a chorus of protest over America's fixation with Moscow's meddling in its political affairs. Enough already. Leonid M. Volkov, chief of staff for the anti-corruption campaigner and opposition leader Alexei A. Navalny, wrote in a recent anguished post on Facebook. What is happening with the investigation into Russian interference is not just a disgrace but a collective eclipse of the mind. What most disturbs Mr. Putin's critics about what they see as America's Russia fever is that it reinforces a narrative put forth tirelessly by the state-controlled Russian news media. On television, in newspapers, and on websites, Mr. Putin is portrayed as an ever-victorious master strategist who has led Russia an economic, military, and demographic weakling compared with the United States from triumph to triumph on the world stage. The Kremlin is of course very proud of this whole Russian interference story. It shows they are not just a group of old KGB guys with no understanding of digital but an almighty force from a James Bond saga, Mr. Volkov said in a telephone interview. This image is very bad for us. Putin is not a master geopolitical genius. Mr. Volkov and others say they have no doubt that Russia did interfere, at least on the margins, in last year's presidential election campaign. But they complain that the United States consistently inflates Mr. Putin's impact and portrays his government as far more unified and effective than it really is, cementing his legacy and making him harder to challenge at home. Ultimately, they say, Americans are using Russia as a scapegoat to explain the deep political discord in the United States. That has left many westward-looking Russians, who have long looked to America for their ideals, in bitter disappointment that the United States seems to be mimicking some of their own country's least appealing traits. The hunt for a hidden Russian hand behind President Trump's election victory has caused particular disquiet among liberal-minded Russian journalists. The image of Putin's Russia constructed by Western and, above all, American media outlets over the past 18 months shocks even the most anti-Putin reader in Russia. Oleg V. Kashin, a journalist critical of the Kremlin, wrote last week in Republic, a Russian news site. He complained that the American media has consistently misconstrued the way Russia works, presenting marginal opportunists and self-interested businessmen with no real link to the Kremlin as state-controlled agents working on orders from Mr. Putin. For Ivan I. Kurila, a professor of history and an America specialist at the European University at St. Petersburg, a bastion of liberal thinking, Russia's prominent and almost entirely negative role on America's political stage since the November election reprises a phenomenon first seen in the late 1800s. Americans use Russia each time they feel their own identity in crisis, said Mr.